Hi, everybody. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, sitting in the Matan Beit Midrash in Jerusalem. What a zechut. This week, we are going to be talking about essentially ridiculous transactions and what you can assume about the people who engage in them. The reason why we're talking about this is because the Gemara in Bava Batra, Ayin Zayin Amud Bet, Ayin Chet Amud Aleph, discusses that when a person buys a tzemed bakar, when a person buys the yoke that holds together the cattle when they're working, they are not purchasing the cattle itself. But the Gemara talks about what if the person pays a lot of money that's way too much for a tzemed? Would you include the bakar in it? And the answer is no. And of course, for those of us who learn Bava Batra, which is many of you, you're asking, what are you talking about? If somebody overpays for something, if it is more than a sixth that they overpay, then the transaction should be null and void. If it's a sixth that they overpay, then they should get the extra money back. And if it's less than a sixth, then the transaction is valid. How come we are not assuming that there is an ona'ah problem here? Why are we saying that, okay, the transaction is valid, you only bought the tzemed, even though you overpaid for it? And the Gemara comes up with a distinction of where ona'ah does apply and where it does not. So the Gemara in Ayin Chet says, Ki Omer Rabbanan ona'ah uvitul mekach, when Chazal say that there's such a thing as ona'ah, and the money should be returned, the extra money, or the sale is invalidated, that's Bekדי hadעת To'a. That's only if the disparity between what the price should have been and what the price is an amount that a person could make a mistake about, right? Aval בכדי שאין הדעת טועה, low. But if it's so much money, the disparity, that it's so obvious to everybody involved, to the seller, to the buyer, that this is way overpriced, we do not say that there is ona'ah problem there. Why? Amer matana yadle. Because what we suggest is that the buyer is giving a gift. Now, that is a really interesting suggestion because, first of all, it relies on a concept called kol t'nai shebemamun kayam. Any condition that is made in a monetary transaction is allowed to stand, meaning we don't say they're violating ona'ah by the buyer paying way more than they should. And the second is the reason why we don't say that is because we assume that the buyer knows and we're reading the psychology of the buyer, right? The psychology of the buyer, this is a ridiculous transaction. Why would it be that a buyer would spend so much money on this? Probably what they wanted to do was give extra money to the seller, either because they wanted to give extra money to the seller or because they're really desperate to get a tzemed bakar and they'll pay anything and they're willing for that extra money to stay. So I want to think a little bit about this concept that people might be involved in ridiculous transactions of their own accord, and we might try to interpret what those transactions are. Now, there are three other places, at least in Shas, where the idea of a ridiculous transaction comes to the fore, and we're trying to read the meaning of what the buyer is doing or what the person who's giving the money is doing. And I say that there are three others, there are probably many more than that, but there are three others that seem to touch specifically on this notion of, does the buyer know? And how do we interpret the buyer's understanding? Now, let's make very clear in these other three examples, it's actually not going to be a buyer. It's going to be other types of transactions. So let's look at the one that actually is most parallel. And I'm going to share my screen. The one that's most parallel is in Bava Batra, Taf Samach Gimel Amud Bet. Give me a second to share my screen with you. Okay. Let's take a look right here in Bava Batra, Samach Gimel Amud Bet. So, Va'amar Rav Nachman says, Hai man de ozif pshite bechavre, if somebody borrows money from their fellow person, va'ashkach be tofiana, and they find extra money in there, right? Kind of reminds me a little bit of Yosef and his brothers, where the brothers go back and say, why is there extra stuff in our amtachot, right? But here, I borrow money from somebody. This is not a case of buying. I am a borrower, and I borrow a certain amount. And then when I look at what I've been given as a loan, I see extra money. So what do? Do I have to return that extra money? The same concept of כדי שהדעת טועה or בכדי שהדעת טועה is used here. So בכדי שהדעת טועה, if this is the kind of disparity where it's likely that a person could make a mistake and the lender mistakenly gave me more money, then you have to return the money, the extra money. The ilav, and if it's not something that people are likely to make a mistake about, matana be'alma hu diyavle. Again, we assume that the extra money is a gift, just like the Gemara that we saw in Bava Batra. But here's what's interesting. This Gemara now delves into, well, hechi dami bechdei shadat toeh. Can you help me understand? How do I know if it's an amount that a person might make a mistake about? Maybe in the case of ona'ah, I know what that might be, right? How you can tell a disparity that's so obvious that everybody knows. But in the case of lending money, how do I figure that out? How do I know if somebody might have made a mistake or no way, nobody made a mistake about that? So Amar Rav Acha Brei to Rav Yosef. Rav Acha Brei to Rav Yosef gives a suggestion. He says, Be'isuryata v'chamishiyata. If it's an extra bundle of 10 or an extra bundle of 5, or that's probably a mistake, meaning the imagined scenario is here the borrower is giving the lender money in kind of denominations of 5 coins or 10 coins, and they just put in an extra one by mistake. So when I see that as the lender, I should give that back. But let's say they put in an extra coin or 2, right? Meaning everything is in denominations of 5s or 10s, and I see 2 coins that are just sitting there. We assume that's not a mistake. They're giving me 2 extra coins. But the Gemara goes further, trying to probe a little bit the psychology of this suggestion that somebody is giving a gift. Because what if this person is unlikely? This lender is unlikely to give a gift. Amarle Rav Acha Brei de Rava Rav Ashi. So Rav Acha Brei de Rava asks Rav Ashi, V'inish takifahu deluyav matana mai. What if the person I'm borrowing from is a real tough guy, is somebody who's just not nice and unlikely that they're giving me a gift? Should I still assume that the extra 2 or 3 coins that I find just sitting loose in there are a gift? So Amarle, he says back, Rav Ashi says back, Dilma migsal gazle ve'ivlale b'cheshbon. This is amazing. This person who lent to you, not a nice person. Maybe at some point in the past, they stole from the borrower. And now what they're doing is they're returning the money. Instead of saying, I stole from you, here's your money back, they're letting it be part of what they're giving you as a loan. Titania, and we have a breita, that actually somebody who does steal from somebody else, they can return the money, balua, sort of swallowed up in another amount that they're giving them for some other reason, right? So the Gemara says, but we're not satisfied, because what if we have a really weird situation? What about if it's a person this borrower has never had anything to do with, meaning it's so unlikely that they ever stole from this person? Are we really going to assume that the extra money is a matana? Amarle. So the response is, well, Dilma inishacharina gazli. Maybe somebody else, right? You can imagine this tough guy might associate with some people who may steal from people. Maybe somebody else stole from this borrower, va'amarle, and said to this tough guy lender, ki yazif ploni pshite minach, when so-and-so borrows money from you, ivlale b'cheshbon, do me a favor, put the money that I stole in the package that you give, kind of let it be in there, kind of nivla, swallowed up, consumed by what's going on in there. So this is great, because what you see is, in the ona'ah case, I understand when I overpay so obviously for something that I need, I either want to give this person money or I'm so desperate for the item that I'm buying it, even if it costs too much, and I mean to give you money. In this case, where I'm like the brothers of Yosef, and I look in my amtachat, I look in my package that was given to me as a loan, and I see extra money, we say to ourselves, okay, well, first let's try to figure out, what does it mean that's, whether it's בכדי שהדעת טועה, that a person might have made a mistake, versus not. How do we figure that out? That's number one, which tells you that in different situations, you may have different ways of understanding whether a person might have made a mistake, right? Like I ask myself, if somebody gave me you know, change for $100 bill and they gave me 6 20s instead of 5, I would assume that that was a mistake, right? There are ways that you can figure it out. But then we say, are there scenarios where it's unlikely that this is a matana? And I love that we're sort of forcing the issue in the name of Rav Ashi to suggest, no, 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 we're looking for it to be a matana. We're looking for it to be a matana. And I find that absolutely fascinating. So that's sort of the first layer of pushing towards how realistic are we being about the intentions of the person who gave the extra, and how much are we maybe pushing a little bit in the direction of matana sometimes. And I do think that what this speaks to is a kind of situation where there's either an awkwardness around figuring out whether it was a mistake, or perhaps the worry is that you're going to lose the money if you ask about it, better not to ask, right? Or maybe there's even a situation where it's not really going to look great if you come back and say, I have extra money here. And they might say, well, how'd you get that extra money, right? There could be all sorts of reasons why they wouldn't talk to each other. Of course, the easiest way and the best way would be to clarify, but in the absence of that ability to clarify, or in the absence of it being positive, a positive development to be able to clarify, right? So that's just a little bit about either the psychology of the one giving the extra money, or the psychology that we presume on their behalf, right? So you have to wonder, when we are presuming a certain psychology on their behalf that seems a little bit dachuk, that seems a little bit forced, what are we really saying about sort of the public policy implications, and that perhaps we're actually doing this for public policy reasons, and not only because this is what we necessarily really think the giver is doing. But there are two more examples in Shas where actually it's not so clear. They're both ridiculous transactions, right? I wouldn't say that this loan situation is so ridiculous. It's just sort of exaggerated, but they're ridiculous transactions. And in these ridiculous transactions, instead of it just being very clear that we say, well, it's a ridiculous transaction, everybody knows, and therefore the money is a matana, there's actually a machloket between Rav and Shmuel. They don't both agree that the money is a matana. Rav seems to think consistently in both cases that the money is a pikadon, is a deposit. The assumption on the part of the person giving the money is that they're going to get the money back, and that they're actually asking the person they're giving the money to guard their money, as opposed to Shmuel, who goes with what basically we've seen up until now, which is the money is a matana. And I want to look at their machloket, because I think looking at their machloket, and especially trying to look at Rav's opinion, it gives us a little bit of an insight into, okay, how far are we going to go with this matana business, right? Where are the places where we're going to say, actually, that's not really the way we're going to interpret it. So here is a ridiculous transaction, and it really is a ridiculous transaction. It's the Gemara in Kiddushin, Daf Mem Bava Batra. A man betroths his sister. Ridiculous transaction. So Itmar, here's what we got. Hamekadesh achoto, someone who betroths his sister, meaning gives her money for Kiddushin. Rav Amar Ma'ot Chozrim. Rav says the money has to be returned. Shmuel Amar Ma'ot Matana. Shmuel says the money is obviously a gift, right? Rav Amar Ma'ot Chozrim. Rav says the money has to be returned because Adam Yodea Shein Kiddushin Tovsin Ba'achoto. The guy obviously knows that Kiddushin are not going to work on his sister. Vegamar Venatan L'Shein Pikadon. And what he decided to do is he's giving her money as a pikadon, as a deposit. She's supposed to watch it for him. V'lema l'lishum pikadon, so just tell her this is a pikadon. Savar lo mekapel. He thinks she won't want to have a pikadon from him. She won't want to have to watch over the money, right? Now this opens all sorts of questions of like, will she be more likely to accept kiddushin money from him than to accept a pikadon from him? Like, are we talking about something that's a theoretical? What exactly is going on here? And also, when is she going to give that money back exactly? So there's a lot here that feels a little bit abstract, but in terms of the principles that are at play, Rav says sometimes when a person gives something that clearly doesn't belong in this transaction, what they're doing is they're just giving a deposit and they expect it back. What about Shmuel, who thinks it's a matana? Shmuel savar ma'ut matana. Shmuel thinks the money is a gift because Adam Yodea she'ein kiddushin tovsin ba'achoto. The guy knows that he's not going to have kiddushin with his sister. And what he did is he decided to give it as a matana, as a gift. So just tell her. He thought it might be embarrassing for her to receive a gift from him. Now, again, I ask myself, is it less embarrassing for her to receive kiddushin from him? This is why it feels very strange, theoretical, maybe even like it's kind of like a scholastic conversation. But the point is, there's a reason why he chose to do the transaction in this way. Whether you say the transaction is he's giving her a pikadon to watch, or you say that the transaction is he's giving her a matana, there is some logic to why he's choosing to do this weird, ridiculous transaction as a way of giving her money. But something for us to note is really Rav's opinion that it's a pikadon is really a divergence from what we've seen so far. I want to give you the other ridiculous transaction, and then we'll think a little bit more about Rav. So the other ridiculous transaction is in Bava Batra Tet Vav Amabet. In Bava Batra Tet Vav Amabet, you have a situation where it's a ridiculous transaction because I'm buying a piece of land, and the person who's selling it to me, I know they stole it, and I buy it anyway. That's a little bit of a ridiculous transaction because I know that at some point the owner is going to come and take the land out of my hands. And yet I do it anyway. So what am I doing by buying this land? Hikirba she'ena shalo ulakacha. A person knows that it doesn't belong to the person who's selling it to them. It's stolen land. Buy it anyway. So Amar Rav says, Ma'od yeshla. The buyer can demand their money back when the real owner comes, but shevach ein. But the buyer cannot demand the money they spent on enhancing the land back. Right? Why does Rav think that they should get their money back? Spoiler, he thinks it's a deposit. Shmuel Amar afilu ma'od. Shmuel says, no, the buyer can't even ask for their money back. But my kamiflage, what are they arguing about? Again, Rav Savar Adam Yodeh Shakarka Ein Lo Vigamar Venatan Lashum Pikadon. Rav says, or holds that the person who's buying knows that this land doesn't belong to the seller, but decided what I'm doing is I'm giving money as a pikadon, as a deposit for this seller to watch for me. So just tell him. Savar Lo Makaba. Thought maybe people don't like to watch a pikadon of somebody else. So I'm going to do it this way. This way I'll have to watch my money, right? You could imagine, I don't know, maybe I'm going out of town. Maybe I usually keep my money under my mattress and I'm going out of town and I want somebody to watch my money for me. So I do something a little ridiculous in order to get my money into that person's hands, right? Or, I always think like maybe I need to alienate it for tax purposes. I don't know that would work halachically. But what does Shmuel think? Shmuel savar Adam Yodea Shakar Ke'ein Lo V'Gamar Tan L'Shum Matana. So Shmuel thinks, like what we've seen all along, no, a person knows that the person who's selling doesn't own the land, and yet I'm giving them money as a gift. So say it's a gift. Maybe it's embarrassing. Again, this is so weird because the person stole the land. So why am I worried about them getting embarrassed, right? I don't know. Is it maybe that ultimately I want the money to be able to go to the person who really owns the land and they'll be embarrassed? It just feels very theoretical. But nonetheless, what it's trying to offer us is there may be a reason to do a ridiculous transaction that isn't about the transaction, but it's about something else. So the Gemara says, wait a second. We've heard this before. Don't we have this argument between Rav and Shmuel in another place? The case of a man who betroths his sister. Rav says the money goes back because it's a deposit. Shmuel says the money is a gift. Why do we need both of those machlokot? So ... The rest of the machloket is listed out. But sricha, the reason why we need it is if we say that in a case of the stolen land, that this is their argument. I understand Rav saying it's a deposit in the case of buying stolen land, because people don't just give money away to random people, to non-relatives, to strangers. It doesn't seem logical. Now, I would add also, Am I giving money to a robber, right? But at the same time, am I giving a deposit to a robber? So there's a lot going on here. But maybe when it comes to a person betrothing their sister, maybe Rav would agree with Shmuel and say, nah, it's not a pikadon. You're giving a gift to her because that makes sense. To your relative, you would want to give a gift. And if you say that their argument is in the case of the sister, maybe only in the case of the sister does Shmuel think that the money should be considered a gift. But in the case of the land, maybe he would agree with Rav that it should be a pikadon. This person is a non-relative. I'm not giving them gifts. Therefore, tzricha we need. Right? So we're getting a little bit more into the logic of the question of gift versus pikadon, right? Just like in the Gemara earlier, we were getting into the logic of would somebody be likely to give a matana? So here we're getting to the logic of would somebody be more likely to give a matana or more likely to give a pikadon, right? But this already, the explanation of Rav, or the perspective, I should say, of Rav seems to be complicating our general idea that when somebody seems to be giving extra of their own accord and they know about it, we assume it's a matana. And Rav says in these two ridiculous cases of a person who is mekadesh achoto, a man who betroths his sister, or a person who buys land that they know is stolen, that in those situations, we assume that it's a pikadon. And I want to understand, and Rishonim want to understand, why is it that Rav says pikadon in these cases? And we don't either argue on him from our original case in Bava Batra of I paid a lot extra for my temen and we assume it's a matana, or we don't argue against him from our original case in Bava Metzia. The lender gave me extra money and we assume that it's a matana and we don't have to return it. What's the difference between these cases of mekadesh achoto or hikir b'she'ena shelo ulekacha, the case of betrothing the sister, or the case of buying stolen land, that Rav says that a pikadon is more likely in terms of what's going on, a deposit. So Tosfot and the Ritva say similar things to try to understand Rav's logic and why he wouldn't say the same in our two original cases. And I think it actually brings to the fore something important, which is what I want to end with. So we're looking at number 5. Omer Rivam, so Rav Yitzchak ben Meir says, we can't argue from the case of paying too much for the tzemed bakar of your own accord being a matana against Rav, the Amar Beperak Ha'isha, who says in the case of Mekadesh Achoto, Adam Yodeh She'en Kiddushin Tovsim B'Achoto, V'Gamar V'Natan L'Shem Pikadon. We can't argue why doesn't Rav should say matana because here it's a matana, so in Mekadesh Achoto it should be a matana. Why? Dahatam, because in the case of Mekadesh Achoto, somebody who betroths his sister, Ein Hamasa Kayam Kol Ikar. It's like the whole transit, the whole action is null, right? There's no kiddushin that takes place. Halakha, but in the case of here in Bava Batra, with buying the tzemed bakar, the inyan tzemed, when it comes to the yoke that you're buying, hamekach kayam, the transaction is valid. And it wouldn't make sense to try to put pikadon into this and say, well, the money that is for the tzemed, that the seller gets to keep. But the extra money, that was only a pikadon. Tosfot would say, we're not going to split it up like that. So in other words, in a case where there is actually a transaction taking place, even Rav would say it's not a pikadon, right? Look at a case like somebody who's mekadesh achoto. There's no real transaction that actually takes place, or the action is not tofes, and therefore say it's just a pikadon. There's no matana here. There's no real there, as it were. And the Ritva says something similar about why Rav wouldn't say this in the case of Lokeach Sadevi Kirba She'ena Shalom, somebody who bought a stolen land. How come Rav says pikadon there, but doesn't say pikadon in other places? The Im Tomar, and if you ask on Bava Batra, what about Rav's opinion that it's just a pikadon in the case of buying stolen land? How come we don't apply that in the case of buying a tzemed bakar for too much and just say it's a pikadon, right? Yesh lomar, possible answer is the shiny hatam. It's different in the case of buying a stolen sadeh. She'en shem davar sheyechol hamecher alav. Because again, there's no real there. It's a stolen piece of property. It doesn't actually belong to the buyer. And therefore, we can't say, oh, the money is a matana. The money for what? The seller doesn't have the possibility to sell it, right? It doesn't belong at all. And therefore, and therefore, Rav says, it's just a pikadon. It's not, the money doesn't belong. So what do we have here in sum? What we have here is kind of an interesting case of both psychologizing, public policy, and what's possible. In terms of psychologizing, we do look and ask if somebody makes a clear, strange transaction or a, over the top kind of transaction. They give way too much money, either in a loan or in a sale, or they do a strange transaction like betrothing their sister or buying land that they know is stolen. We try to psychologize and think, what are they actually doing? They actually giving money as a matana? They actually giving money as a pikadon, right? That's number one. Public policy wise, we also sometimes say, even if we're not sure that they would really mean it this way, it seems that sometimes we force the issue, as in a case of somebody who likely wouldn't give you a matana if they were giving you a loan, but maybe they stole from you in the past and they're putting extra money in, or they're doing it for somebody else, right? And that seems to be a little bit more public policy oriented. And the third, I would say, we actually try to figure out what's possible. Is it even possible to say that the money is a matana? If you're talking about a transaction like someone betrothing their sister or somebody who is buying land that's stolen, if there's no there, can you even say that the money is a matana? Even if they want to give you a matana, can you even say it, right? And it seems like according to the Ritva and according to at least some of the Balei Tosfot, if it's something where there's no there, you're just going to say it's a pikadon as a deposit. You're not going to say it's a matana. So I hope you enjoyed this edition of ridiculous transactions and what might actually be behind them. Look forward to learning with you again soon.